Good afternoon. My name is Rudy Frias, Swamp Fox Frias, and today I want to talk about how vintage baseball can benefit from podcasting and how we can tell our stories. Okay, so real quick, this is my story of vintage baseball. My family has been involved in vintage baseball for 29 years. We got our start here in Columbus, Ohio, with the Ohio Village Muffins in 1992. Um, we are. Oh, sorry. Hang on. Um, I personally began playing as a junior muffin, and I was it's essentially kind of like a farm team. Think about that. Think about it. It was a team made up of all of the kids of the adults on the muffins, and then some of my family members, and then some members from my little league baseball team. And so we would go around and play senior citizen homes and communities, and it was a lot of fun. I eventually became a full-fledged, full-time Ohio Village Muffin. And in 1998, the Columbus Capital Baseball Club was formed as a team offshoot of the Muffins. I was able and lucky enough to play for the Canal Fulton Mules from 2005 to 2006. And I got the wonderful honor and experience of playing for the Gotham Baseball Club out of New York. So just in general, I have a wide variety of range of experience in vintage baseball. Now, let's go to the next slide. There it is. Um, I want everyone to think about two questions right now. Just think about these questions. And it's funny because they were kind of brought up in the last presentation. I want you to think about the typical response you get when you introduce someone to vintage baseball. That there and it doesn't have to be, it can be a spectator, it can be someone you work with, or someone that you meet on the street. And I want you to think about how vintage baseball is perceived outside of the community. We have um, we've all experienced this in some way. I mean, we can see the faces that these people make when we explain what vintage baseball is. We can hear the questions replay in our mind. I mean, the one, no gloves, that's by far the one thing people say the most. um, I want you to think about what you say to them. What is your response to them when uh, they ask these questions, and how we are promoting the community and the game of vintage baseball? While you think about that, I want you to enjoy this little clip here.
If that was any lower, I'd have to dig to Hades itself to find the apple. Why not dig a trench? Then the ball would be as low as you seem to wish it to be. That was no strike.
Now, some of you may be familiar with that clip. If you're not, that clip is 17 years old. It's from 2004, and you might recognize a face or two. And I must say that only Miklich would buzz the tower of a late night talk show host. And I love this clip. It's hilarious. If you're not familiar with it, you can find it on YouTube. It's Conan Plays Old Timey Baseball. Now, this clip is very popular, millions of views. Millions of people have seen this clip. Now, I want you to think about how can we as a community or you as a club have the same kind of reach as this clip. You're not going to get the same like numbers of audience, but how can you get that reach? I think that's possible through podcasting. Now, why podcast? Um, Number one, there's an audience out there. If you look at the two maps on the right-hand side, these are the statistics for the March episodes of the Vintage Baseball podcast. If you look at the top map, that is obviously is the United States. And I want to give a quick shout out to California and Alabama. Thanks a lot. In the month of March, California and Alabama downloaded the most episodes of the Vintage Baseball podcast, unseating the top states of Ohio and Michigan. So that was really exciting to see that that's happening. And in the lower map, you can see that there is a global audience for Vintage Baseball. I'll never forget getting my first listener from Ireland and being like, is this a joke? Are you serious? But then it has grown, Russia, South America, Canada. There is an audience out there, because in my presentation last year, I think I mentioned that there were over 5 million episodes of podcasts available for consumption out there. Now that there's an audience, why should we look into podcasting, or why could you do a podcast? I think it strengthens the connections with each other. A podcast is a very easy way to stay in touch and stay connected with our friends that we only see once a year, or maybe once every other year. We get to stay updated on how they are doing and how their club is doing. And really learn more about baseball in different areas of the country. Obviously, like there are different rule eras and rule sets being played across the country, and there are different events, and it's a good way to stay connected to that. Educate. I think that a podcast is an excellent source of education for individuals out there. When people hear nowadays, people have so many more resources available to them. So there's social media, there's obviously the internet, there are podcasts to find out about vintage baseball. And this is another resource that we can give the community outside of vintage baseball to learn about not only the history of baseball, but the community of vintage baseball. We talked about recruitment in the last presentation. I believe a podcast is a wonderful recruitment tool. It's accessible. It doesn't take a lot of time to sit down and listen to a podcast, and you can use it as a recruitment tool. When people say, I've never heard of this before, and you'll be like, well, do you listen to a podcast? Here's our podcast, and you can find out more about the club in your area or the clubs across the nation. Now, how can we tell your story? How can you tell your story? Last year, I broke down all the equipment that I used to put on the Vintage Baseball podcast. And I encourage you, if you want that detail, go back and watch my presentation from last year, because I really break it down. I give you pictures of all the equipment I use and where I'm finding that equipment. Right this time, I want to tell you that the easiest way, if you just don't want to mess with all this equipment and it seems like too far out of reach for you to grasp, literally you can use your cell phone. There are apps, and the logo in the lower right hand corner is called Anchor. That is Spotify's podcasting platform. It's a free app. You download it to your phone, and then you just talk into your phone. You can produce a podcast. You can record, you can mix, and you can send out a podcast from your phone for free. You don't need any of this equipment. Um, if you're unsure, if you're like, I'm not sure about podcasting, I'm not sure you want to jump into that pool immediately, that's totally fine. Use what's available to you. Social media is available to us. Um, we see individuals live streaming games, and that's fantastic. Now that does come at a price, right? The social media is a beautiful double-edged sword. While yes, you can reach a wide audience quickly, um, we need to realize and recognize that vintage baseball no longer exists in this nice little bubble that it did decades ago. And we want to think about what we're putting out for mass consumption, for a large group of people who are wanting to learn about us as a community, and whether what we're putting out is benefiting to the community. Because if we put out something like negative or more self-serving, that's going to read to an individual wanting to learn about our community as a reflection of the community. So that's, I mean, I always put that out there. And, you know, speaking of getting out there to learn about our community, Matthew Bernard and the Barrel Roller and his podcast, Roller Out the Barrel, that is a great example of letting the community learn about the people who play vintage baseball. It's focused on individuals, the players that you meet, that you see on the field. I mean, do you want to find out whose favorite condiment is horseradish or who loves elderberries? Well, you're going to find it on the Roller Out the Barrel podcast, and I encourage you to check that out, because maybe someone that you've actually played against and only know by their nickname has been a guest on that podcast, and you can learn a little bit more about who they are outside of our community. Now, where does your story begin? Vintage baseball spans over 40 years. And are you a newer club? Are you an older club? Are you Luke Skywalker in the New Hope? Or are you Luke Skywalker in the Last Jedi? What is your experience? Where do you fit on that timeline? And that's where you can share your experience and share your story. You have everything you need right here in your pocket to make a podcast. Now what do you do once you have everything you need? You have to identify who who is the story about? Who are you talking about? What is the story? Like, do you have a scrumptious little tale that no one else knows about? Share that. When did that happen? Because as we stated, and Matt has shown us, vintage baseball is being played across the country. And we don't know all the details about where vintage baseball is being played. I found out about Kennett Square and their amazing field last year because people were live streaming the game that they held. And I was like, wow, that is a beautiful field. And so that really, these details are gonna matter. Now, the most important point I feel for and out of all of these five is the why. Why are you doing this? Why are you telling your story? Why go through all the trouble to get it out there to people? Is it to strengthen a connection? Is it to educate? Is it to recruit? Are you hoping that, you can get this out to two or three people and they'll listen and they'll be like, I want to learn more. How can I join the club? And I really, when you focus on those five components, I think in itself, you don't have to be a master storyteller. You don't have to be gifted with gab. You can tackle those five components one at a time, and you've got yourself an interview and a podcast and a story to tell. Now, what is the Vintage Baseball podcast approach? Now, as as we said in our very first episode 1, season 1, the hosts definitely are not historians, and we don't put ourselves out there that we are historians, because we know that requires an amazing amount of research and dedication, and those amazing individuals exist in our community. But what I wanted to focus on was the history of vintage baseball, of our community. Having a family engaged in the community for 29 years, and having met members who have been engaged in the community for the 40 plus years, you really want to focus on that, because there are countless stories there. The Vintage Baseball Podcast is adapting. We just got, last summer, there was pretty much no baseball being played. And how can you generate content and episodes about vintage baseball when there's no vintage baseball being played? And you have to get creative. And we've done everything from a mock draft, a vintage baseball mock draft, to a vintage baseball March Madness tournament. And it's literally just trying to create new content that's different, that will get people engaged. And it's about connecting. All of that is focused on making that connection. I believe it was 2008. I heard Jason Gypsy Kladova's Vintage Baseball This Week, and it I felt when I heard it for the first time, I felt connected to the game that at that time I wasn't getting to play as frequently as I wanted to, and that kept me engaged in the community, and finding out what was going on. It strengthened that connection, and that's what I want to focus on with the Vintage Baseball Podcast. And lastly is preserving. I mean, whether it's talking to the pioneers of Ohio's first club, the Anderson family, Big Bat and Aces, or it's talking to the trailblazing manager captain of the first women's vintage club, my mom. We want to preserve everyone's experience and story for future clubs or individuals who want to learn more about vintage baseball. This clip I'll play for you is a sneak peek, if you will, of what the Vintage Baseball Podcast, the new series of the Vintage Baseball Podcast, that we will be putting out soon.
So I'll let Kobe tell how it all transpired and went down, and then I'll throw in my jabs here and there.
I will start by saying I was hitting number 9 in the order. I love that place. It's like the second leadoff. So glad to be in that 9 hole. But I walk up to the plate regardless of that situation, and I toe the line, or split the line rather in this case.
Hey, back up, everyone!
And at third base, I see, or I hear first rather,
Big Mamba.
the big Puma. The big Puma down at third base. And I had to look and smile and say, this is a guy that doesn't normally play third base. He's out down there yelling things like sugar shorts at me. So I go,
I'm going to teach this SOB a lesson.
I'm smiling, you're smiling, you know what I'm going to go for. So I get any pitch in the inside, I'm going to give it a good old...
Turn on it?
Turn on it, hack it right at you. And I think I successfully connected. You did put a paw on it.
First off, if I would have gripped it, I would have made a hell of a play.
Okay, wait, stop. Kobe is correct. He made contact. It was a screamer down the third base line. JD turned his body
To the side, because I wasn't taking it in the family jewels, I'll tell you that much.
He tried to make himself as lean as possible, and then he swiped at it.
And I almost highlighted it. It came in hot, I went like this. I got a mitt on it, I almost came back with a throw. Would that not have been crazy? I almost scooped it, came over the top of the throw.
So his description is accurate, but he's leaving out on one foot because he lifted his leg as it got closer to him.
Hey, in my defense, that was a piss rocket. And for me to get a mitt on it, I was happy about it.
Here's the description. If you've ever played Mike Tyson's Punch Out, you know Don Flamenco.
That's a good call out right there. Anybody who gets that, that reference, please comment on our page.
So that was inspired by, like, the audio dramas that we, they used to be radio dramas, and now podcasts are doing audio dramas. Or honestly, I listen to a lot of NPR's Radio Lab, and that clip is from our first season, I believe, and it's after a game against the Ohio Village Muffins, and it was it's just another way of adapting and sharing our stories, because we all have those, whether it's on the field of play, or you hop into Winnebago and you're on that long road trip across the country, or over 250 miles, and you're sharing stories of something funny happens on that road trip. That those stories can connect to not only our community, but the community at large.
So I'll let Kobe.
There we go. Now, sharing the stories and helping the community grow is how are two things that I feel like are easily accessible for anybody interested in starting a podcast. You don't need equipment like this. I had a lot of time on my hands, so I was like, I'm gonna do this. You literally can just talk to your phone, put the phone down on a table, engage with someone during a match, after a match. Yes, if it will look a little out of place if during a vintage baseball match there are people holding a cell phone, live streaming a match, or holding a cell phone talking to another individual. But we can separate that. We can suspend our disbelief, even for a moment, for the betterment of our community. And we can share these stories. A number of the individuals here today, from the professor to Corky to Matt to Mr. Tootle, Mr. Kimnack, have been guests on the Vintage Baseball podcast, and I cannot thank them enough for joining me and sharing the stories of vintage baseball. We just did a fantastic episode. It was released last week, or this week, I'm sorry, with the Rules and Customs Committee, and in an attempt to engage the community with questions about things that are happening out on the field that they're not sure what the call was, and then we would present those questions to the Rules and Customs Committee, and then they would engage in conversation and help the community learn how to handle those situations if they arise next time. I think these are all tools that we can use, not only as clubs, but as individuals, to not only strengthen our connection with each other, but strengthen our connection outside of the bubble that is the vintage baseball community. That is my presentation. And I set a timer. I beat the timer. I'm pretty proud of myself. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to let me know. I'm seeing the chat was not up when I was presenting, so I'm seeing all of this.
Yeah. Let me unmute everybody here for a second here. See if I can get that to work. There we go. You can, Rudy, you can tell you're getting old. You can remember you when you were 2 feet high on nothing meadow, trailing along after your father. So yeah, maybe that's a sign. Anybody have any questions for Rudy, young Mr. Rudy, I should say? Yes. Great program.
Thank you.
Actually, not necessarily questions, but just to build upon what Rudy said. This is I'm Chris Tonstead from the Elizabeth Resolutes. two things that you brought up that I want to build on. You mentioned the suspension of disbelief as far as using modern equipment, before or after the game to kind of get that experience so it's preserved. Before I got involved with the Resolutes, our local historical society, the Merchants and Drovers Tavern Museum, they would ask for volunteers. So we would volunteer just to kind of help out. And then eventually they would get you in costume, and during events, they actually also share space with the Rahway Cemetery. So one of our big things every Halloween is to have a tour of the cemetery at night, and they tell, the oddball stories of, things that go on. We have a story about the unknown woman who was murdered, who has just a grave, an old soapstone headstone that just says unknown and the date of the death, and weird stuff happens over there every once in a while. So we record that. We actually have paranormal investigators come in, and weird stuff does happen. And if you didn't have that modern equipment, you wouldn't know that. So absolutely, that's just to go to your point, to be 100% historically accurate isn't necessarily a good thing. During the gameplay, of course, you want to try to minimize it, but no, that's a really good point. The second thing about the live streaming, that's something that I wanted to do when I came on to the team. Our first game was against the Atlantics this season. And of course, it was the first game after we lost our founder, Paul Salamone. And of course, we're really good friends with the Atlantics. They helped us out a lot when the team has been constantly rebuilding. And this year we actually have a really good core of guys. So when we went out there, we wanted to do something to kind of commemorate Paul. So my wife was with me and she had my phone and we're trying to record it. And the video was good, but the way the phone is set up, the microphone is facing the wrong way for the good lens. So audio wasn't really that good. So for our next game, the last weekend against Monmouth Furnace, I invested in a couple of things. So this is just a basic like tripod that you could put a phone on, relatively inexpensive. I forgot how much it was. It probably wasn't more than $20. And then a basic shotgun mic that plugs into your headphone jack on your phone. Because I tried to live stream our games last weekend, but I didn't have the battery. So I started doing some experimentation, and unfortunately our game this week was canceled because of rain. But if you get one of these rechargeable battery packs and you hook that up, you set this up, you can let this run the whole game. I think my battery finally crapped out at about an hour and change. I think it was like an hour 5 when I looked at it, but this will essentially recharge it and sustain it. And I'm hoping our next game, I'll set this up and be able to live stream. We usually do double headers. We do one game, our rules 1870, and then whoever we're playing. Usually most of the teams around us are 1864. So I want to live stream it, and then at the end of the game, pause it if I have to. I actually have 2 of these. So if the battery does discharge a lot, I'll just swap it out for the other one. And I'm hoping that using that in live streaming builds awareness. And then granted, it's only to our Facebook page, but what I've done is created events on our Facebook page, and I shared it with our local city community page. And last weekend, we actually had, he's not necessarily a city council member, but he's involved with the city. And he actually took some awesome photos of us and actually put a sepia tone filter over it. Great shots of our captain, Craig, just knocking the hell out of a pitch. Great shots of me filling in as pitcher. So it definitely works. I think he just happened to stumble across us, but now he actually follows us on Facebook. So doing simple stuff like this, if you have access to it, I think this setup minus the phone, you could probably get it for less than $50 on Amazon. And you'll see like this shotgun mic, there's like a dozen different variants of it, and it's all the same thing. I usually shoot for like middle to low price range.
I'm sorry, we got to move on now. We're at the
Okay.
next guys.
But yeah.
Thank you very much.